Well, thank you for the presentation and for the invitation, and thank you all for being here. This presentation will be developed on the field of political epistemology, where I am working right now. It's a cross-pollination, I think, a field of cross-pollination between epistemology, the reflection of knowledge and its place in society, and political philosophy, the discipline concerned with ways of organizing public life. The fundamental premise of political epistemology is that the analytical and conceptual tools of each of these subfields of philosophy influence the other. And this because it starts from the understanding that the epistemological questions are at the heart of our political lives. So this confluence, of course, may seem obvious, but is relatively new for analytic philosophy, and it has enriched the inventory of the problems of epistemology and its methods. So epistemology is no longer, or at least not only, about elucidating the concept of knowledge through solitary exercises aimed at fabricating paper debates or imagining fanciful mental experiments. Rather, it engages with pressing problems which set their own conditions and times, problems that affect communities here and now, problems in which knowledge involves asymmetrically situated groups marked by injustice. And we will see some of this in the following, because I work mostly with the relationships between trans groups and the state, or trans groups and institutions. And for considering this inspirational slogan, I will follow a lot the work of Sajid Moore. She's a bioethicist who works on disability, and well, she took this slogan as a framework for analysis, so I am going to follow her path. You know, nothing about us without us is a slogan that came from disability rights activism. James Carton used it as the title of his book, published in 1998, where he claimed to have adopted it from social movements in South Africa and Mexico. Movements that, well, he says, demanded self-representation and control over the resources necessary to live a dignified life. This slogan expresses how people who were historically marginalized demand participation in different aspects of community life, especially the issues that affect them, and implies rejecting the passive role that has been attributed to them, and aims to transform it also by considering that it is these people who should be at the forefront of any decision, research, formulation of policies or institutional decision that will, at the end, affect their lives. Since 1998, until now, this slogan has spread and has been adopted by different groups. Within the field that concerns us here today, it is sustained from two fronts: trans politics, advocating for human rights, and trans studies, promoting new understandings of gender, sex, and trans experiences in general. Right. This distinction between trans politics and trans studies sure deserves a clarification. Well, it's more analytical than descriptive, because, among other things, the people who have developed and are involved in the field of trans studies tend to be advocates. But what I am interested in pointing out here is that we have an epistemic dimension, an academic field, actually, and a political dimension, advocates that intend to influence, and they do influence the public sphere. And, well, also the two dimensions are intertwined. And I also want to highlight that this entanglement leads to changes which are also mutually reinforced. On the one hand, we have changes in the way in which trans experiences are understood, and on the other, changes in the place that trans people occupy in our society. And well, I mentioned trans studies. Allow me just to mention a few key points about this. As a theoretical field, trans studies has brought a lot, but I will point at 4 core contributions. It questioned the notion of sex as a pre-discursive, coherent, and stable material reality, which could be then reflected by gender. It destabilizes the assumption of the bionivocal relationship between sex and gender. It vindicates the first-person knowledge and understands trans experiences in non-pathologizing ways. Well, you know, trans people entering the academy a very long time ago. They did so through a variety of existing disciplines, primarily as a research topic or object. And the emergence of trans studies is more recent. It's often traced back to the 1970s, and its emergence represents a forceful questioning of the traditions that took trans people as an object, in particular biomedical research and feminist theory. In an article that is usually cited as foundational to trans studies, The Empire Strikes Back from 1991, Sandy Stone highlights this. She raises objections to colonial discursive practices that she attributed both to the epistemologies of white male medical practice and the rage of radical feminist theories. And she said, bodies are screens on which we see projected the momentary settlements that emerge from ongoing struggles over beliefs and practices within the academic and medical communities. That is why she speaks of transsexuality as a literary genre. She adds that with every theory, culture speaks, I'm quoting her, culture speaks with the voice of an individual. And the people who have no voice at all in this theorizing are transsexual people themselves. So she points to the need for a deeper analytical language and, well, calls for a construction of new narratives, new trans narratives that could serve as counter-discourses. She said, I'm going to quote her, from outside, she's asking for counter-discourses from outside the boundaries of gender, beyond the constructed oppositional nodes which have been predefined as the only positions from which discourse is possible. So there is something magical here because she performatively creates the community that she is addressing. And, well, precisely the fact that trans people take the floor after a history of academic objectification is actually considered the fundamental characteristic of trans studies. According to Susan Stryker, she's an editor of Trans Studies Quarterly. It's a quarterly academic journal of trans studies in the United States. She said, just as disability activists said in the 70s and 80s, nothing about us without us. What's most significant is creating an opportunity for the privileged and powerful kinds of knowledge production that takes place in the academy about trans topics or any other area that involves people to be not just objectifying knowledge, what we might call knowledge of, but also knowledge with, knowledge that emerges from a dialogue that includes trans people who bring an additional kind of experiential or embodied knowledge along with their formal expert knowledges. And well, here we return to the starting point, to the precept that summons us today here. And we can try to move forward with an answer at least to the first question. What does it mean, nothing about us without us? In other words, what are we committing ourselves to when we embrace this motto? And I'd say I'm going to follow more. And she said, well, we can distinguish two dimensions, an individual and a collective one. I'm going to apply my considerations to trans issues. The first one aims at consolidating epistemic authority of trans people and promoting their capacity to make autonomous decisions in all spheres of their lives. And the second dimension, it's a collective dimension, aims to facilitate the participation of trans people in the public sphere. Here is not only about my own life, but about the production of norms, the production of public policies, the design of institutional decisions, and also research. And about how trans people can and should participate in the process of, well, designing, implementing, monitoring all these initiatives, which will, well, necessarily affect their own lives. Between these two dynamics, we have this looping effect, because it is clear that if you don't have epistemic authority, well, you probably cannot be part of processes of public participation. And, well, at the same time, if there are groups that are not part of these processes of public deliberation, they will find that their life options are limited, and they will hardly have the possibility of making autonomous decisions. So we can think about the individual dimension using the following example. Well, if I have to make a decision regarding my health, regarding a medical treatment, in order to decide, I need, well, epistemic authority. First, I have to understand what that treatment implies. The institutions have to be accessible to me, and I need to have options. On this basis, we can distinguish several aspects of this dimension which are also intertwined. First-person authority. Here I am thinking mostly about first-person epistemic authority over one's own gender identity. Now, introspection, in this case, provides us with privileged access to our gender identity, and access to this knowledge from the third person is necessary through testimony. Autonomy, this refers to the ability to make decisions over one's own life. For it to be meaningful, trans people's decisions must be respected, even if they challenge what others consider reasonable. In health, this is related to informed consent, of course, and the problems derived from pathologization and medical patronizing. Through the filter of pathologization, sounds coming out of the mouths of trans people are routinely discredited as confused expressions of sick people. And biases can cause a listener to attribute more or less credibility to a speaker. Pathologization here plays an important role in this phenomenon and undermine the ability of trans people to make autonomous decisions, even if they can articulate words. Negative prejudices about trans people and prejudices derived from the diagnosis result in the systematic devaluation of their credibility. And, well, this brings together the special type of injustice we already talked about, this testimonial injustice. More mentions the idea of accessibility, referring on the one hand to information and on the other hand to institutions. In order to be able to consider options and to choose between them, trans people need to know what alternatives they have, understand the consequences and implications of each of them, and enact their decisions. In addition, trans people must be able to access institutions, or rather, institutions must be accessible to them, and that idea of accessibility refers to availability, proximity, quality, and affordability. So, you know, when informed consent is a mere formality, it's just a form that has to be signed to make just the medical team or health institutions unaccountable for any contingency or any problem you may face, or when people have to migrate to access health institutions that provide the services they need. Access on accessibility is not really working. Alternatives must exist and must also be accessible. If there are no alternatives, then I don't have much to decide. And warranties of the exercise of rights. The decisions we make have consequences, but if the exercise of rights entails the loss of other non-incompatible rights, then we are facing a scenario of coercion. And this happens, for example, when the exercise of the right to gender identity implies the compulsory renunciation of reproductive capacities, or, for example, forced divorce, or the loss of any other fundamental rights. So, nothing about us without us, in its individual dimension, implies fundamentally having authority, autonomy, access to information, alternatives, and the warranty that the exercise of rights will not cost us other non-incompatible rights. So we can now move to the collective dimension. The collective dimension refers above all to the terms of participation. What does it mean to have collective participation in public sphere? Well, we can consider this by dividing this question into two. What is the issue being discussed, and who is part of the discussion, and in with what capacity? Each question, as you see in the slide, refers to a fragment of the slogan, nothing about us without us. And I would like to approach them by presenting parasitic forms of the idea of participation that account for a number of ordinary problems that we should consider in order to address what we want nothing about us without us to mean. So, nothing about us. What is at stake here is the question of what is being discussed. At this point, we must understand that trans perspectives matter not only when it comes to trans issues, but in all areas of life. However, there is a general tendency to assume that all trans people are first and foremost, and perhaps only, trans. So the role is then to ensure something people tend to call the trans perspective, which is undoubtedly assumed to be automatic and obvious. Trans people are never linguists, they are not biologists, they are not Marxists or liberals, although in fact they are, basically because they are never expected to participate as such. They are trans, period. Consequently, whatever their profession, whatever their background, if they are invited to participate in research processes, it will generally be to talk about trans issues. Of course, some of them are in fact specialists on the subject, but not all, and in the end, they all are interchangeable with any other person who fulfills the requirement of being trans. And we can move to the other part. We said, well, without us. The question we apply here is the question of, well, who is in the room and in what capacity? And to answer this question, I think we must pay attention to, well, many issues, but I chose those three: role, expertise, and conditions of participation. When we talk about role, well, the question here is, are trans people epistemic subjects, objects, or informants in other people's research? Well, first, one of the most basic ways of misinterpreting this idea of nothing about us without us is to understand that this without us can be breached by a nominal presence of trans people. Nominal presence implies that certain experiences are just thematized, but the people who embody them well, they do not have a relevant role in the conversation. Too often, trans people are not part of the conversation, but merely objects of alien interest. And well, this is the idea of objectification, understood through the influential perspective of Martha Nussbaum, is taking to involve the denial of someone's epistemic agency, and of course, is a problem that undermines trans people's ability to participate. Many other times, trans people have some active involvement in the research, but still their epistemic agency is restricted. They become mere informants. And in these conditions, they are turned into mere passive bearers of factual records devoid to interpretation. I don't know if I have a slide here with the quote. Yeah. As Jose Medina says, the epistemic agency of an informant, co-informant, is limited and subordinated to that of the inquirers. It is at the service of the inquirer's questions, assessment, and interpretations. When one is allowed to be an informant without being allowed to be an inquirer, one is allowed to enter into one set of communicative activities, those related to passing knowledge and opinions, but not others. Precisely those others that are more sophisticated, happen at a higher level of abstraction, and require more epistemic authority, formulating hypotheses, proving and questioning, assessing and interpreting opinions, and so forth. And we can go back. For the last point, I was thinking about the question, well, are trans people there just to pose for the photo? No? How relevant is their participation? And let's think about knowledge production processes, for example. Sometimes, many times, and I'm thinking about Argentina, research that includes trans people in the team. Let's think about empirical investigation. Well, they include trans people. Trans persons are called upon to fill non-epistemic, sometimes accessory roles or secondary roles. For example, they are the people who apply the questionnaires. But, well, were they part of their elaboration? Are they the ones who defined the methodology and the objectives? Were they involved in the evaluation processes? Well, Viviane Namaste, she is a sociologist and trans activist who has worked extensively on the production of knowledge with marginalized communities in Canada, points out that research subjects should be involved in all aspects of the research, including defining the questions, gathering the empirical data, analyzing the results, and presenting the findings. And this principle is very important, but it is usually translated, she points, in a very narrow way, that she says the community provides access to the field so that the researcher obtains data to answer the questions that they have posed. Now, again, are there trans people on the advisory committees? Are they the ones who define the priorities? Well, sometimes trans people, are included in research teams as tokens. No? Tokenism is a conflict management technique derived from the demands of marginalized groups for participation. And it consists of making minimal superficial concessions to minority groups with the sole objective of avoiding accusations of prejudice and discrimination. In general, it takes this form. Companies, organizations, state institutions, research teams incorporate a minimum number of trans people just to generate a fiction of equality or diversity, and to show themselves or their organization, offices, or cultural product as progressive. And it is usually one trans person alone. And this measure benefits those who incorporate them more than it benefits the trans person and the community. Why? Well, thinking about participation issues, in practice, tokenism is far from being the beginning of a process of community involvement. And well, Rosabeth Kanter has claimed that it is actually an obstacle to new incorporations. And on the other hand, the trans token is faced with a situation of asymmetry that leaves them at a disadvantage when it comes to debating and making decisions. This means that their voice is generally not taken into account and exposes them to experience of fetishization, disqualification, silencing, epistemic extractivism, and plagiarism. So here we could include considerations also regarding the number, no? How many people cover that we in Nothing About Us Without Us. But let's move to the point of expertise. If trans people participate as epistemic subjects, do they do so in their capacity as experts on a certain subject or in their capacity as trans people? Many times the incorporation of trans people in research obeys more to an ethical commitment. Researchers notice there is no one trans in the team and they decide to include one trans person. And when the research is about trans people, often it is assumed also that trans people are experts on trans issues in general. In a sense, the logic of epistemic authority over one's own gender identity is here expanded, and trans people are considered epistemic authorities over anything related to trans just because of being trans. And while in general this is intended to give a hierarchy to trans people's knowledge, it often has the opposite effect. And there are two reasons for this. Firstly, because that kind of practice leads to disregarding any current area of expertise of trans people by virtue of normative expectation that only authorizes them to talk about transgender issues when not about just their own gender or their own experiences as transgender, as if they could not address other issues. In this sense, whether they are dedicated to chemistry, classical literature, or history, their academic training is irrelevant, even if they have been trained in gender studies, because what counts is their native knowledge, not their scholarly knowledge. As Juna Victoria, trans scholar from Brazil, has pointed out, we cannot occupy the specialized speaking space from a scientific point of view. This means that it does not matter if the trans person is in a postdoc, if she is researching in the field of public policies on health or on employability applied to trans people. She will always occupy speaking spaces as a user of the health system or as a subject who demands specific rights. And well, this consideration of expertise due to gender identity refers to first-person authority, which undoubtedly applies to issues such as gender identity. But what we find in the background, sometimes more explicitly than others, is the thesis of standpoint privilege. Now, in a nutshell, standpoint privilege means that those who are socially more disadvantaged are nevertheless able to access an epistemically advantaged perspective. The problems of this thesis are well known in the field of social epistemology. A very significant one becomes evident when disagreements between people who would be equally privileged are taken into consideration. A position held by an epistemically privileged subject from the perspective of the standpoint privilege is incorrigible. This is difficult to reconcile with the existence of disagreements between individuals who are part of the privileged group. So the question is, what is the privileged perspective in a case of disagreement between two positions? If we say, well, it is the two, we have a theory that endorses contradictions and we have no privilege at all. And if we say it is one of them, then such positions are not incorrigible, and what we have is not an epistemic privilege, but a criterion of correctness. The latter is what usually happens in practice. In the name of an alleged cognitive advantages, there are those who choose the position they like best and award it with the laurels of epistemic privilege. Claudio Cormick, an Argentine colleague, speaks of the cherry picking of the right oppressed. That is the one who, well, does not disrupt, who does not challenge the status quo, and, well, who happens to think like me. And then we can consider the last point, the conditions of participation. According to Nora Bernstein, epistemic exploitation is a pervasive phenomenon that takes place when privileged persons compel marginalized persons to educate them about the nature of their oppression. And this pedagogical task is unrenounceable and is often presented as a step towards justice and truth. However, well, she said, it maintains structures of oppression by centering the needs and desires of dominant groups and exploiting the emotional and cognitive labor of members of marginalized groups who are required to do the unpaid and often unacknowledged work of providing information, resources, and evidence of oppression to privileged persons who demand it and who benefit from those very oppressive systems about which they demand to be educated. This forced epistemic work is often ineffective, given that the social identities of marginalized people undermine their status as epistemic subjects. They are rarely taken as authority or as peers. Additionally, the efforts they must put into this enterprise imply a very high practical and emotional cost, while it lacks symbolic or material benefits. At the end, the physical and emotional erosion of the epistemic exploitation, Bernstein said, is paid in years unlived. And this is true even if marginalized people resist providing their services, because such resistance tends to socially confirm the prejudices that sustain the very condition of marginalization. So, nothing about us without us. We already have an idea of what it means, but the second question is, what do we want it to mean? I think that the B-side of all these points is part of an answer that, of course, is not complete, and I hope we can think about it together. Thank you.
Gracias, Blas. Thank you, Blas. So now we have